Wyoming Territory, 1886. Sheriff Wesley Marsh was 34 years old and had ridden through worse storms than the one that caught him in the high country that afternoon. But he had never ridden through one on a trail that turned to soup under his horse's feet without warning. Braveheart went down at the worst possible bend, one foreleg sliding out from under him on wet rock, and came back up favoring it badly enough that Wesley knew, before he'd even dismounted to check, that they wouldn't be making it back to town that day. He led the horse the rest of the way down the mountain by hand, rain soaking through his coat, until the trail opened onto a small, isolated homestead tucked into a fold of the hills, smoke from the chimney, a fenced corral, lamplight already lit against the gray afternoon. A young woman came out onto the porch before he'd finished knocking the mud from his boots. "That's a bad step," she said, nodding at the horse before she'd said a word of greeting. "Bring him round to the corral, slow." Her name, she told him once Braveheart was settled, was Mabel Thorne. She was 28, sharp-eyed, and moved around the injured horse with a calm that seemed to settle him faster than anything Wesley had tried on the ride down. Her mother, Ruth Thorne, 55 and steady on her feet, despite what she called a little less spring than there used to be, came out with a lamp and looked Wesley over with the frank assessment of a woman who had been sizing up strangers on her land for 30 years. "He'll live," Mabel said, running her hand down the swollen leg. "But he won't be ridden for 3 weeks, maybe longer." Wesley looked at the darkening sky. "I'll walk back to town then," he said. "You'll do no such thing," Ruth said. "The bridge over Cutter's Creek went out with the first storm this morning. A rider came through an hour before you did. Said half the crossing's sitting in the creek bed now. There's no road to walk back on until someone rebuilds it, and no sense drowning yourself trying." She looked at her daughter. "Mabel." Mabel didn't look pleased about it, but she nodded. "Until the bridge is passable and the horse can carry you," she said. "Not a day longer than that." The first days were, by Wesley's own private accounting, mostly awkward. He had spent his whole career trusting his own judgment about horses, and it did not come naturally to hand his best animal over to a young woman surrounded by dried roots, glass bottles, and stacks of old books he couldn't read the spines of. He found himself watching every treatment she performed the way he'd watch a suspect handle evidence, closely, and with more suspicion than the moment probably warranted. Mabel, for her part, did not care for it. "You're hovering," she said on the second morning, crouched beside Braveheart's leg with a fresh poultice in hand. "I'm observing." "You're hovering like a man who thinks a badge makes him an expert on horses." Ruth, sitting on the porch step with her mending, did not bother hiding her amusement. "A star on your vest doesn't make you a horse doctor, Sheriff," she called over. "Any more than it makes you good company at breakfast, though I notice you've managed the second part better than the first." "I wasn't aware I was being graded on either," Wesley said. "Everyone in this house is graded on everything," Ruth said placidly. "Mabel simply grades harder." Mabel shot her mother a look that Ruth met with the serene expression of a woman who had raised her only child and intended to enjoy watching her be teased by someone else for a change. By the second afternoon, Wesley found himself, without quite meaning to, standing at the edge of Mabel's shelf of books while she was out at the well. One was open on the table, a worn volume on herbal treatments, its margins crowded with handwriting that wasn't hers. He was still reading when she came back in. "That's my mother's writing," Mabel said, not unkindly, catching him at it. "She taught me most of what's in that book before I ever read a page of it myself." "I wasn't looking to pry," Wesley said. "You were," Mabel said, "just carefully." She took the cup from his hand and refilled it without being asked. "You do everything carefully, Sheriff. It's your most obvious habit and your worst-kept secret." As the horse improved, Wesley started making himself useful around the place, mending fence, splitting wood, reinforcing a sagging corner of the barn roof, and going along with Mabel into the hills when she needed to gather more of the herbs her stock was running low on. Why Braveheart? he asked her once, on one of those walks, nodding back toward the corral. Bold name for a horse that spooked at a wet rock. Wesley was quiet a moment before he answered. Named him Young, he said. Figured a horse that scared easy needed a name that'd remind him otherwise. He didn't look at her while he said it. Turned out to be more of a reminder to me than to him. Mabel let that sit without commenting on it, which he seemed to appreciate more than any response would have. It was further along that same walk, gathering yarrow on a shaded slope, that he finally asked the question he'd been circling for 2 days. You worked in town? He said. For 2 years, Mabel said. Why did you leave? She pulled another stem free before she answered. Because the doctor found my hands useful and my voice inconvenient, she said. He let the town believe a mistake he'd made was mine instead. It was easier for everyone if I was wrong and he was right, so that's the story the town kept. That wasn't fair to you. No, Mabel said. She was quiet a moment, working the next stem loose with more force than it needed. My mother turned a spare room into a treatment room and told me to keep working, whatever the town thought of it. I did. It's smaller than what I trained for. It's also mine. Wesley didn't offer sympathy she hadn't asked for. He only nodded, and on the walk back he caught himself slowing his pace twice whenever she stopped to examine a plant. The second time, when he looked over, she wasn't looking at the ground anymore. She was looking at him. It became a habit neither of them announced. Wesley started bringing coffee out to the corral on cold mornings, setting it on the rail near wherever Mabel was working before he went to whatever chore Ruth had assigned him that day. Mabel, in turn, found herself listening for his boots on the porch steps come supper time, waiting, though she wouldn't have called it that out loud, for whatever story he told about his years riding patrol through the territory. Ruth watched all of it from the edges of the house with an expression of quiet satisfaction and developed, over the course of 2 weeks, an unusually specific talent for remembering chores on the far side of the property whenever the two of them lingered too long in the same room. You'd think this house had twice the fences it actually does, Mabel said one evening, once her mother had excused herself for the 3rd time that week to check on something at the far gate that did not, in fact, need checking. I've noticed the same thing, Wesley said. She's not subtle about it. No, Wesley agreed. She isn't. Over one of those coffees, Mabel asked him something she hadn't before. What do you do, she said, when you're not on patrol and there's no fence needing mending? Wesley considered the question longer than it seemed to need. Clean my gun, check the office ledger, ride the perimeter again in case I missed something the first time. He looked at the coffee in his hands. I've never had much reason to answer that question before. Never had much waiting for me besides the next patrol. No family close by? None left, Wesley said. House I grew up in burned when I was 19. Never saw much point rebuilding a home for just myself, so I never did. The office in towns had a cot in the back for 6 years. That's been the whole of my address. Mabel didn't say anything to that right away. She only refilled his cup, the way Ruth had refilled his first one, and let the quiet between them do the rest of the talking. He complained, more than once and with real feeling, that Braveheart received considerably more attention in that household than the horse's own owner. He's an easier patient, Mabel said. He doesn't argue about the poultice. I don't argue, Wesley said. I ask reasonable questions. You interrogate a bandage, Sheriff, Mabel said, and he laughed loud enough that Ruth, from the far side of the yard, smiled to herself without turning around. By the 2nd week, a neighbor's boy brought word that the Cutters Creek crossing had been shored up enough for careful travel, and Wesley borrowed the neighbor's gelding to ride into town for a few hours, to check on the office, reassure his deputy he was alive, and collect a change of clothes. His deputy, a steady young man named Foss, who had kept the office running competently in his absence, took one look at him and did not bother hiding a knowing grin. Bridge has been passable 2 days, Sheriff, Foss said. Man could have ridden in yesterday if a horse's leg were truly the only thing keeping him. The horse needed watching, Wesley said. Sure it did, Foss said, and did not say anything further, though the grin stayed exactly where it was. Wesley returned to the ranch before dark with a bolt of clean bandage cloth, a small sack of coffee, and a used medical volume he'd found at the mercantile that he thought might interest Mabel. He hadn't announced when he was coming back, and it was only riding up the last stretch of trail that he noticed Braveheart, still limping gently in the corral, lift his head and nicker at the borrowed gelding's approach before Mabel herself had even come to the door. She had been watching for him longer than she wanted to admit, and said nothing about it, though Ruth noted it anyway, from the porch, with the quiet satisfaction of a woman collecting evidence for a case she already considered settled. It was Ruth who raised the harder question first, one evening while Mabel was out checking the stock. "He'll go back to that town eventually," Ruth said to her daughter the next morning, not unkindly, folding linen at the kitchen table. "Sheriffs don't leave their offices forever, Mabel, however long a horse takes to mend." "I know that," Mabel said. "Do you?" Ruth said. "Because I've watched you wait for his boots on the porch, same as I've watched him wait for yours." Mabel set down the cup she was drying. "He's a guest, Mother, a kind one. That doesn't make him a fixture." She was quiet a moment. "And even if it did, I won't leave this ranch, or you, to go live in a town that already decided what it thinks of me. I built something here that doesn't need anyone's permission. I'm not walking away from it for a man who admires me during a crisis and might not want the quiet of this life once the crisis is over." "Has he given you reason to think that's all this is?" Ruth said. Mabel didn't answer right away. "No," she admitted. "That's what frightens me more than the alternative would." Ruth reached over and patted her daughter's hand, saying nothing further, because some fears were better left to prove themselves wrong on their own time than to be argued out of existence before they were ready. It was on an ordinary afternoon, 3 weeks in, that the horse's recovery caught up with both of them faster than either had quite prepared for. Mabel was kneeling by Braveheart's leg, wrapping a fresh bandage with the same unhurried competence she'd shown the very first day, when Wesley noticed the horse set his weight down evenly on the leg for the first time since the fall, without so much as a flicker of favoring it. "Looks like he's nearly well," Mabel said, glancing up. Wesley smiled, though the news landed in his chest with an unexpected weight of its own. "I'll leave as soon as my horse is better," he said. Mabel looked up at him, something careful crossing her face before she let herself answer lightly. "Then I hope he heals very slowly," she said. They both laughed. Mabel's hands stilled over the bandage for half a breath before she bent back to the knot, pretending it required more of her attention than it did. Braveheart, sensing the pause, leaned his head against her shoulder, and neither of them managed to hold the other's gaze for very long after that. From the porch, Ruth, who had come out to call them both in for supper, saw exactly what had passed between them, and slipped back inside before either one noticed she'd been standing there at all. The rancher arrived at the gate 2 days later, half frantic, his boy running a fever the town doctor hadn't been able to explain. Mabel agreed to come at once. Braveheart's leg was sound enough by then for gentle walking, but not for the hard pace the errand demanded. And Wesley wouldn't risk the horse's recovery over pride. He borrowed the rancher's second horse instead, and Ruth rode in the man's wagon alongside her daughter's box of remedies. They arrived to find the town doctor already there, the same man Mabel had once worked beside, examining the boy for fever alone, his questions focused entirely on chills and appetite. He hadn't been told about any wound. The boy, ashamed of a fall from the hayloft 2 days earlier, had said nothing to his mother, who'd assumed a scrape she'd noticed briefly had already closed. It was Mabel who noticed the boy favoring one leg when he shifted on the bed and asked, gently, whether anything had happened to it recently. The doctor, informed of the fall only then, examined the leg himself and missed, in his haste, the second smaller wound higher on the calf, hidden beneath a stocking he hadn't thought to remove. Mabel found it within minutes of her own examination. The doctor did not take well to being corrected in front of the family. A woman without medical training has no business overriding a physician's diagnosis, he said. Wesley's hand moved, out of old instinct, toward the authority his badge carried. Mabel stopped him with a look before he could speak. "Let the family choose," she said. "Not you, not him." The boy's mother looked between the three of them for a long moment, and then stepped aside and let Mabel through. Working with Ruth beside her, Mabel cleaned the hidden wound, drew out the source of the infection, and worked through the night to bring the fever down. Wesley spent those hours outside, tending the family's other animals and keeping the yard quiet. Careful, this time, not to insert himself into the sick room at all. By sunrise, the boy's fever had broken. The old doctor, standing in the kitchen with the family gathered around him, admitted, with considerably less pride than he'd shown at the bedside, that Mabel had found what he'd missed. He did not apologize for the 2 years he'd let the town believe worse of her. He said only that he'd been wrong about the leg, and left it there. It was smaller than the reckoning Mabel might once have hoped for, and she said as much to Wesley on the ride home, her voice flatter than her usual tone. "He admitted the diagnosis," she said, "not the 2 years before it." "No," Wesley agreed. "Not yet." It was that same evening, once the exhaustion of the night had worn thin enough to let old feelings surface, that Mabel turned the conversation toward what had happened at the gate. "You reached for your badge," she said, "before I stopped you." "I did," Wesley admitted. "I spent 2 years with men deciding for me what I was allowed to do in a sick room," Mabel said. "I don't need a well-meaning sheriff doing it more gently than the last one did." Wesley was quiet a long moment. "You're right," he said finally. "I wasn't trying to control you. I was trying to protect you. I didn't see until you said it plainly that from where you were standing, those looked like the same thing." "They're not," Mabel said. "Not to me." "I understand that now," Wesley said. "I'll try to remember it." She didn't answer with forgiveness right away, and he didn't ask for it. But she poured him a second cup of coffee before bed that night without being asked, which was, between the two of them by then, its own kind of answer. Word moved slowly at first. 3 mornings later, Ruth opened the door to find 2 horses tied at the rail and a woman standing on the step with a coughing child against her shoulder, not sent by the boy's family directly, but by a neighbor who'd heard the story secondhand and decided, on her own judgment, that the Thorn Ranch was worth the ride. Mabel treated the child at the kitchen table while Ruth kept the ledger, writing the family's name into a book that had, until that morning, held mostly her own household accounts. When the family had gone, Mabel stood at the wash basin longer than the task required, scrubbing her hands well past clean, and Ruth understood, watching her, that her daughter was working through something older than the morning's visit. 2 years of a town's cold shoulder, finally beginning, in one small and unannounced way, to thaw. "It isn't the whole town yet," Ruth said gently. "No," Mabel said. "But it's someone who came because they trusted my hands, not because a man in town sent them my way out of guilt." She dried her hands slowly. "That's worth more to me than anything the doctor could have said." Braveheart was fully sound within the week that followed. Wesley saddled him on a clear morning, his few belongings tied behind the saddle, and tried to make the moment look like any other goodbye. He mounted, turned the horse toward the trail, and made it several lengths past the gate before he drew rein and sat there a moment, not moving, as if some part of him hadn't yet agreed to what the rest of him was doing. Then he turned Braveheart around and rode back. Mabel was still standing near the gatepost when he swung down again. "You didn't make the joke this time," he said, about hoping he'd heal slowly. "Because he's well," Mabel said. "I've no more reason to ask you to stay." Wesley reached up and unpinned the star from his coat, not to give it up, but so she'd understand plainly that what he meant to say next carried no authority behind it except whatever was left in his own chest. "Then don't ask the sheriff," he said. "Ask the man." Mabel looked at him for a long moment, and something in her composure finally gave way. "I don't want to see you go," she admitted. "I spent half my life believing home was wherever duty happened to send me," Wesley said. "It took a bad step on a wet trail and 3 weeks in this house to show me the one road I'd never learned to recognize, the one that leads back to somebody waiting." Ruth came down off the porch at that, unhurried, and looked at the two of them with the plain satisfaction of a woman whose instincts had been right from the very first night. "The guest room will still be here," she told Wesley. "At least until you and Mabel give the preacher a reason to ask which Sunday the two of you are free." Wesley rode back to town properly this time to settle his affairs, and did not, in the end, give up the badge. He simply stopped treating it as the only thing that told him where he belonged. He split his time from then on between the small sheriff's office, with Foss minding it capably in his absences, and the Thorn Ranch, riding out whenever his duties allowed, and staying, more often than not, considerably longer than duty required. He courted Mabel properly through that autumn. Sunday dinners, a ring ordered quietly from the same mercantile that had once sold him the medical volume. A conversation with Ruth conducted with more nervousness than he'd shown facing down armed men. Ruth told him, with her usual bluntness, that she'd known the answer since the second week of his stay, and saw no reason to make him wait for her blessing longer than the ring took to arrive. He asked Mabel at the corral, of all places, with Braveheart standing beside them both as if he had some stake in the matter. She said yes before he'd finished the question. Together that winter, the three of them turned an old shed on the property into a proper treatment room, for people and animals both. Ruth kept the ledger and greeted the patients. Mabel handled every treatment herself with a steadiness that no longer needed anyone's permission to be trusted. Wesley mended whatever needed mending, rode into town for supplies, and made a habit of appearing, without being asked, whenever anyone tried to question what two women were doing running a treatment room without a physician's name over the door. One morning that spring, a small used book arrived at the ranch gate, left without a note, an old text on wound care, the same doctor's hand visible faintly on the flyleaf where he'd once signed his own copy. Mabel never mentioned it to anyone but Ruth, and never quite forgave the man for the 2 years, but she kept the book on the shelf beside her mother's, and that, she decided, was reckoning enough. Wesley and Mabel married that spring in the small church in town, with Ruth in the front pew and Foss standing awkwardly at the back in his good coat, and Braveheart, well enough by then to make the trip, tied outside at the rail the whole ceremony through. Months later, Braveheart ran the high pasture again, sound and strong, the injury nothing more than a faded scar along one leg. Wesley came back from another patrol one afternoon to find Mabel already waiting for him at the corral, Ruth watching from the porch with the same quiet smile she'd worn since the very first storm. "Has he taken another bad step?" Mabel asked, nodding at the horse. "No," Wesley said, "but I may need to keep bringing him around, just to be sure." Mabel laughed and kissed him gently, while Braveheart stood beside them both, unbothered, and from the porch, Ruth busied herself with a jar of dried herbs she didn't actually need to sort, satisfied in knowing that the horse's recovery hadn't marked an ending at all, only the beginning of a family none of them had expected to find on a rainy afternoon in the mountains. Wesley Marsh had spent half his life reading trails by the marks horses left behind. It took Braveheart's worst step of all to show him the one road he'd never learned to recognize, the one that leads back to somebody waiting. He found a ranch that didn't need him to prove anything, a mother who saw exactly what was happening before either of them admitted it, and a woman who had learned to build a life where her own certainty was enough, long before the rest of the world caught up to it. May God bless each and every one of you who listened today. Until next time, keep riding.